Hello and welcome at Book Lovers Companion. My name is Edith, and right next to me is my lovely co-host, the Chattering Teacup.
Hello.
Back from her tea things. She has been immersed in all kinds of tea recently, but she's back again and she is here to chat with our guest from Florida, Daniel Bautz. Hello, Daniel, and welcome at Book Lovers Companion.
Hello. I'm so excited I finally get to talk to you, Edith, and you, Teacup. Been listening to the show for a very long time, so I'm just ecstatic to have the opportunity to talk about my writing with both of you.
And so are we. I said before I hit the record button, there's a lot to talk about. Let me tell you that. Because your first novel, Life is in the Blood, came out this year after you've written quite a number of short stories.
That's true. Yes, came out in February through Anatolian Press. It's my debut, and I mean, I couldn't be more ecstatic. It was quite a learning curve going from kind of just publishing short stories and doing kind of self-releases to actually being with a publishing house and going through that whole process. But I'm glad to bring the world Life is in the Blood.
And so are we, to be honest. And a teeny tiny hint is already in the title what the book is about. And since I'm always afraid to give too much away about the plot and maybe also the characters, I thought we leave it up to you to tell us about this book of yours.
So the book is set in the 1890s in the heartland of the United States. So we're talking, I believe it starts in Ohio, where a preacher is starting to create his own following. And there's something special about him. And one of the things, he is creating his own cult around the power that he has in his own blood. And because of what he does as a preacher or to create these cults, after a little time in a single place, people begin to notice things and he becomes problematic. So he's had to be nomadic, moving from town to town until he moves to a town in Ohio that has a sequestered community nearby that doesn't really go outside their own society. So now he has a way to get blood to perform his sermon, so to speak.
Oh. And what I also found interesting in this book of yours was the characters or the other characters. You have an author, you have a sheriff, and you have quite a strong Amish woman. They play a major role in this book of yours. It's not just a preacher. And we learn a little bit about the changes that come with the turn of the century, because your book takes place in 1897. And what I found interesting is that the modern world is moving from the east to the west. And it also means a lot of change for one of your characters, namely Sheriff Flynn.
Yeah, I thought that was a good time to set it. Also, it's post-Civil War, which, was the major, at this point, one of the most traumatic incidents in American history. And it's also kind of right in the midst of the Industrial Revolution. So like you're talking about, that the creeping technology is beginning to clear away the liberties of the frontier, and it's infringing on those who have learned to live a life free from the concerns of society. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of starting infringing on them. And that's where kind of Sheriff kind of has dwelled, the Sheriff Flynn has kind of dwelled, because he's a former slave that, is now free and has created this life for himself in this frontier town. And now that is beginning to change because, and he's not liking it. So he's thinking about moving further west, but he gets pulled into the whole, mystery, of what's going on with the blood cult.
Mm-hmm. And your other character, the author, Brannigan, he came with his parents to the United States. They were Irish, or his parents came and he was born there. And what I found most interesting was Sheriff Flynn's attitude towards Brannigan being Irish.
Well, it's funny because one of the things that like happened, especially in the Northeast, if you're like a student of American history, is that, you had the emancipation of the slaves after the Civil War. And, there were certain attitudes, certain racist attitudes that kind of were presented towards the African Americans that were now found themselves as free men, trying to make a way in the world as a living. And then you had the potato famine and things pushing the Irish across the ocean. And it wasn't uncommon to see a sign in a window saying, black, Chinese, welcome, Irish need not apply. Like literally there was I'm trying to think, I don't want to get too controversial, but I remember reading in a writing of a British lord traveling through Ireland, and he referred to the Irish as white apes. So there was this prevalent attitude towards the Irish as though they were less than human. They should just be workers and be silent and not heard. And that was one of the things that I don't think a lot of people are necessarily aware of, that a lot of segregation happened along the lines of, what your country of origin was. So not necessarily just along the lines of skin color and ethnicity.
Yeah. I wonder if, because I just read that during the time, the second half of the 19th century, the immigration has risen quite a lot. So did animosity between the groups get stronger on the same lines, or?
I guess you were kind of breaking up there. Can you repeat that?
In the second half of the 19th century, immigration has risen quite a lot, as far as I've read. So, and the animosity between the different groups of immigrants, did it also get stronger, or was it more or less the same as before?
I think it got stronger because, you had like everyone's kind of coming in through Ellis Island for the most part. And you had all these different neighborhoods. You had Italian neighborhoods. You had, Irish neighborhoods. So I think it grew because everyone's struggling to find a place in this new world. And when someone new is coming in, they're kind of trying to push you out of that ground that you already established. So I think that kind of tension rose as more immigrants came over to the United States and trying to find, a new life and start that specifically in the 19th century.
And what also struck me as interesting was the fact that Sheriff Flynn, you already said, so he was a slave before he became a man of the law, and he also fought in the Civil War. But what was interesting for me was the fact that he didn't fight on the side of the Union. He fought on the side of the Confederacy.
Again, that's one of those things like in history that people don't talk a lot about. A lot of slaves were sent in the place of, a rich man's son, basically. So because they allowed for that. And so, I mean, I don't want to say a lot, but a significant number. And it's one of the things that kind of gets swept under the rug because I don't know if it's just not clean and concise history. It's messy, like real life, So, and when I came into understanding this part of the history, it was a particular person that should be way more famous than what he is, that kind of, I don't want to say completely modeled Flynn after, but he was certainly the spark of inspiration for me, was an individual called Bass Reeves. He's also rumored to be the inspiration for the Lone Ranger, but he was a former slave who gained his freedom after fighting for the Confederacy. And he went on to become one of the greatest lawmen the Wild West ever knew. I mean, there are literally statues built for him and have been standing down in the South, and I can't remember right now exactly where it is, but I want to say Arkansas area, Arkansas, Oklahoma, somewhere around there. There's a statue celebrating his work as a lawman in the Wild West.
Mm-hmm. I see. And this blood cult, I do not want to give too much away, of course, because otherwise, where did the idea for that come from?
Yeah, I'm a student of history. So, and the weirder the better. The weirder it is, the more I like it. There actually was a blood cult in the Midwest that I don't know exactly what the time frame was, but that they created. When I learned that, I got the idea of a what if, which I think as a writer, that's what you're always looking for. The what if. What if this really were happening? Because this guy he was killing cattle and taking, and he ran out of his own cattle and started killing other people's cattle, and that's how he got caught. And but I was like, well, what if somebody could actually, basically the thought was, what if a vampire took this idea and tried to create a following and a legion of his own through his own blood, with using this theology to fool people in, to bring people in and fool them, to make them think they're doing the right thing, when really all he's wanting them to do is do his bidding.
Yeah, exactly. I found this take quite interesting. It's a complete change, actually, of the whole idea. You just said it. I keep saying it. This vampire idea. Not giving too much away, I hope.
No.
And I found it interesting because until now, you always got the idea when we deal with vampires, no crosses, no Bible, no whatever that has to do with established Christianity. And yet here we go, or you go, along a different line. And that's quite interesting. It's his way of getting people, like you said, to do their bidding. You can, how shall I put it? You can get people to things they wouldn't do otherwise, were it not for religion.
Yeah, I mean, it's like and another thing I thought, like, as far as that goes, like, he's going to actually be able to show them some kind of real results for what he's doing. You don't, the one character, Princess, he brings him back from the brink of death through the power of his blood. So how can you deny what's happening? And he's instead of couching it and allowing himself to be seen as kind of this monster, he's trying to say, well, no, this is God's will, and this is the gift that's been given to me that I've given to you, rather than saying, no, come and follow me. He's like, now you're not following me, you're following God. So it's like he creates his own legion through God by proxy, is basically the best way I can say.
Yeah, true. And when he realizes, I also found it interesting, this turn of events in your book, because when he also moves east, because Flynn is had a run in with our adversary Silas, and he decides, okay, I have to change a little bit my tactics, gathering a following. And when he moves east, he realizes, why not making use of a community that is already very close-knit, secluded, cloistered. This was the word you used in your book. Yeah. The perfect victims.
Yeah, and I don't even really understand where that idea initially came from for me, but it was like he needed basically a group of, for lack of a better term, cattle to feed his growing legion, and that's what he found there, quite by accident.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also where Miriam, our other character, comes in. Her need to find something else. You've said it in her Rumspringer. It's an interesting time for the Amish, where they have to find out which way to go. Join the English or join the community.
And they have to decide.
Yeah. And here comes Silas, and he offers something different.
right. And I thought that was a good way to create like a lot of friction within all the groups, really, except for Flynn and Brannigan. They had their own friction. But like within the group, the core group that's around Silas and within Miriam, I think that brought a lot of dramatic value. But I also like, as I was writing Miriam, I really grew to identify with her probably more than any of the other characters that I wrote. Because as I dug into the Amish faith and the Amish community to kind of understand, because I didn't want to present kind of just a stereotypical view of what the Amish are. I really wanted to understand like what it meant to function within that community. And I know they've gone through their own evolution as a community since, they came over here. But it was interesting to see where they fell on everything. Like I thought for sure that the father was the heavy hand, going into this, like for example, with Marion, because I know she's got an issue with, she's chosen this young man that she goes poorly to kind of court. And, I thought like it would just be on the father to say yay or nay, but it turns out that that's not the case at all. And that there is definitely more of a split of the duties within the family that is definitely more even-handed than I expected. So it's like their culture is definitely different than I anticipated going into it, but I'm glad that I did the research to find out, because I think I have a better representation of what they are. Not that it's the only way or if it's absolutely 100% correct. I'm sure other people would know better, but I thought that was really important to bring out. And Miriam, I guess, kind of personifies all the positive aspects that I found within that culture.
And you said, I mean, that would have been my next question. I mean, research, like we said, we have a lot of, I suppose, misconceptions about the Amish. And how do you research, and how much time and effort did it take for you to find out what you wanted to find out about this religion and their way of life, actually?
That was probably the biggest part of the research that I did, and it ended up being something I wanted to just kind of be cursory. I just wanted to kind of get a little bit of their dialect and make sure that I was representing things right. But as I dug into it, I'm like, okay, well, I totally misunderstood this. I totally misunderstood this. All the aspects of how they choose their deacons and their all of that. Like it's so much more rich than I imagined. So much more developed than I imagined, because I thought, they're simple folk, but they really do have a way, a strong system of, for lack of a better term, communism that really has worked and survived, through now at this point, almost 200 years. And that allows them to continue to persist in a world that's increasingly encroaching upon them. So going back to I did copious amounts of research. That was the biggest. I mean, I had in the office that I had at the time, my walls were covered. It looked like the crazy conspiracy theorists, where they got the lines going all over the place, maps and things like that. So I just, that way I could just kind of look up and quick reference if I'm doing something correct. I read papers, like published, peer-reviewed work on the Amish and their culture. Even the magic system that they kind of had, that I kind of worked into their, that they only turn to in the most dire of times. All of that. I mean, that took a couple months, realistically, for me to get all that information, sorted out and make sense within the construct of the book itself.
And we've got one type of religion or interpretation with the Amish. And on the other hand, we have these preachers, which is also about religion, but a different way. How much research did you do on different preachers? Because I guess it was fertile ground in these areas back then.
So a lot of what was happening then was what they called kind of revival services. So there was a lot of small groups that were popping up. doing that, the revivals, and they would have their little following. They would travel from town to town to do these revivals. And so it wasn't abnormal in that time to have a preacher walk into town and start preaching a sermon and start set up shop, and maybe they stay, or maybe their time runs out, they get, and then they move on to the next town, almost like a traveling circus. So, I mean, that was more of an evangelical bent. So you would have a couple sermons, and I think I kind of worked that in there because, Silas is repeating his sermons over and over again. He's beginning to realize, as I'm setting up and this is where I'm staying, I might need to learn a little bit more about or people are going to, start to become tone deaf to the message, even though I might be able to give them a miracle. Because one of the things about miracles is that if you are lucky enough to have one happen in your life, the further distance you get between the miracle and time-wise to where you are, the less you grasp the power of the miracle. And so that begins to wane over time as you get distance from it. So that's one of those things where there was a lot of research there, but I didn't put a lot of it in the book.
That's true, because you have to decide at one point, how much put in the book and how much to leave out from the book to not
overload it.
Yeah, not overdo it. And I have to ask you, you left the door open. At the end of the book, you definitely left the door open. Tell me. Usually I ask about the plans at the end of our podcast, but please tell me. Tell me. There is another one.
I just finished I have another book coming out in September. I just finished another one. Next book on my plate to start writing is the next one of this. So yes, there should be more.
Oh.
Expect more.
Oh, that's good. That's good, because I felt at the end of the book that you haven't definitely not finished Miriam's story, and definitely not the relationship between Flynn and Brannigan.
Yeah, and I don't know exactly where I'm going to take all of that, and it's like I go back and forth. I'm still trying to kind of formulate the plot, plan, and structure of the adventure going forward, because there's a lot of avenues that I take. I mean, I think that the story stands on its own, and I think it's a complete story. But there, like you said, it's very open ended, and there's a lot of avenues that I could see this going. I actually had one reader comment that they were unhappy about someone surviving because they were hoping that it would create a chance for, I don't want to give away too much, a chance for the story that they were compiling to be put out as its own book.
Okay.
Kind of Fantastic Beast style, like.
Well, I got the impression halfway through the book that you might going this route of telling us, okay, we finish one part of it, and you're going to leave open the door for another, and I was right. And now, of course, like I said, I'm hoping for another one because I want to learn more about our characters.
That makes me happy to hear. I mean, I that's when I write, I start with characters, and then everything else has to kind of fall in around it. And I try to treat, and I don't know if I'm always successful, but I try to treat even the smallest character as if they're a real human being. They have their own backstory. So even if it's the coffin maker, he has his own backstory, or,
True.
So character, I think, is the most important thing to telling a story, because if you don't care about the characters, you don't really care about the story. Like it gets kind of to be like a throwaway thing.
Yeah, exactly. And sorry, Teacup, but Miriam at the beginning, she seems to be like this butterfly flying around she seems that way, from one flower to the other. But in the end, at the end of the book, it turns out, man, that woman has balls.
That makes me so happy to hear that, because like a lot of the feedback I get is about Brannigan, or it's about Flynn, or it's about Silas. And to me, the one that, and I said this, the one that I identify the most with is Miriam, because I feel like that's a character arc that goes from, like you said, kind of she's like a butterfly, and then she finds her strength, and she's absolutely pivotal in how the story even unfolds, let alone turns out.
Who was the first character that came to you?
The first character was Silas. It was Silas. He was the crux of the whole thing. Once I had the antagonist, it was like, okay, now how do I approach the problem? And I knew the time frame because the piece of history I found, and that's kind of, I don't know how well that would have worked if I had moved it up 40 or 50 years, or even into modern times, because I mean, although those things still exist, the attitudes towards them are different, because just like the turn of the 20th century, 21st century, the 19th into the 20th, there's all these questions. And I think as human beings, we look at these lines, and even though they're imaginary, we envision them as epochs into new ages. And really life's just going to persist, but there's all this anxiety that builds around and all this uncertainty. So you tend to find the opportunity for grifters to come in and kind of make their fortune, so to speak, on those anxieties.
Mm-hmm. Because of the changing times, I suppose, like you said, because it becomes uncertain.
Yeah, and really, that's just our anxiety about an imaginary line on a calendar. We're getting ready to flip it to 1899 to 1900, or we're getting ready to flip it from 1999 to 2000, and we get, as societally, as a world, we get anxious about those things for some reason. I don't really understand that, but it's something that I've observed throughout my life. So to answer Teacup's question, yes, Silas was the first. That was, but Brannigan existed before the book, but he was never really written intended for the book. That's a little, if I can, it's a little aside. I actually woke up at 3 a.m. one day, and I had this whole scene in my head, and I just got up and I typed it all out. And that is the introduction for Brannigan in the book.
Okay. I see. And how challenging, maybe it's the wrong word for it, but was it for you to write Flint, or to do his character justice?
I mean, once I got into the head of the character, it was to do him justice was just to be true to what the character was. So I felt like, I know one of the things I never really wanted it to be out there for readers that, he was a freed slave, because I think I don't really even expose that till he moves from his hometown into a new town. That's really in the book, but I mean, it's already out there, so I'm not spoiling anything. But in the book, I want to say that's 50, 60 pages into the book before you even find out his ethnicity, because in his world, no one saw him as that anymore. They just saw him as the sheriff, because he occupied that space so well that they didn't think of him differently as any other community member. But once he left that community, now he had to face these challenges in a world that wasn't as accepting.
And I think you did a good job, because I felt the same way. I didn't read the blurb, because I usually don't, because I want to get into the book and then find out more about it. I want to get my surprises while reading the book. And like you said, it is very, very late in the book when I realized, Sheriff Flynn is actually a black man. I never saw him as that until you mentioned things about his past.
Did you get any feedback from readers regarding this point? That it maybe changed a view of him or not?
No, actually. I mean, people, I think, loved him right away. That's the feedback that I've got. People I would say he's probably the most liked character, from the feedback that I've got. And that just starts the beginning. And, not a lot of people mentioned, nobody's actually mentioned the fact that, they just kind of accepted it and move on. And I don't know if that's because they read the blurb and then that they just kind of had that foreknowledge going into it. So, that I haven't, this is the first time I'm hearing somebody actually having that kind of honest discovery. That I was hoping that people would get like, oh, wait a second, he's okay.
Yeah, it was like, okay. Interesting.
It shouldn't matter. Yeah. So
no, it didn't actually. It
yeah,
was just
good.
It was this aha moment, Yeah. Actually, and because then we've mentioned it before, there was a lot of tension between different groups in society, and his attitude towards Brannigan was even then a bit more surprising, because of what we know and what we are used to think, probably, because only a dead Irish person is a good Irish person and so on.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of showing that he has also, everybody has their own set of prejudices and nobody's free from that. And I don't think that'll ever be that way. And it doesn't always fall along the same lines. I think that's a kind of important thing to throw out there. Like, some people might be angry that everybody has bushy eyebrows. I can't stand everybody. It doesn't matter what we eliminate. Someone's going to find some reason to nitpick somebody about something. So I thought it was a fun way to show that, those attitudes aren't just, in one place. They're all over the place, and everybody has them for good or bad.
And would it be fair to say that the genre of your book could be described as Western horror or horror Western?
I think that's an apt description. I wrote it in my mind as an adventure. Like, to me, and I kind of hope it reads that way. I hope it's, when people read it, it goes really fast. They enjoy it. There are aspects of horror in there because you're dealing with vampires, you're dealing with some kind of horrific situations. But by and large, it is, for me, in my mind, as I was writing, it was an adventure story.
And historic adventure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It was a fascinating and fast-paced read. And you've mentioned one book. I'm not saying which book. And I thought, because I wasn't sure about the time it was set at the beginning of the book, because I thought, is it present time or is it past? I wasn't sure about that. And then Brannigan gets a book from his publisher. And and he mentioned, it's the new thing in England, and it will also be the thing here, and give it a try, and so on. And then I thought, now I have to look up when that was published. That will give me an idea. Okay, now things became a bit clearer then for me for the setting, which is okay, I'd say, because I like to find out things such as this.
Yeah, I like to hide things. One thing I can understand is that readers are typically very intelligent people. And they're also very curious people. So if they have a question, chances are they're going to look to find out what that is. And rather than just kind of spoon feeding everybody everything, I'd like, or hope, that when they read something like what you mentioned, that they'll go, hey, it's okay. I get it. You can kind of get a sense and feel that, like, okay, there's people are riding in trains, there's horse, there's like model, there's like a few cars, but not a lot. There's gas lights, electric. You're going to kind of figure out real quick that you're not in the modern world, but where exactly are we? And, I didn't really necessarily feel that was necessary for me to spell that out, but I gave clues as to, when the time. But you found one of them.
Yeah. Because I couldn't let it go. Let's put it that way. And I wanted to ask you about your writing process, because at the beginning we said you started out writing short stories, and this is your first novel. Compared with writing short stories, what was it that you found most challenging?
Well, most challenging is, like, when I sit down to write, I don't always know where a story is going to lead. So what was challenging for me is to understand, like, I kind of had the idea for the beginning, an idea for where I wanted this to end up. And I'm more of a pantser, and I'm sure you're familiar with that phrase. I mean, not that I don't do,
Yes.
like, I will do a little bit of plotting between chapter to chapter, but I really don't do the whole overarching thing just because I want to keep track of things, make sure things don't get too, off the rails. So a story is as long as it needs to be. For me, a story is as long as it needs to be told as it completely as I can.
Mm-hmm.
So when I started to sit down and say, if I envisioned this as a novel, but if it ended up as a short story, then, if it's 10,000 words and I feel like I told the whole story, that's fine. But this is definitely much bigger than a short story. And so so the process was this kind of knowing at some point when it was going to be a novel and not a short story. I think it became evident pretty clear when I was just still laying out a lot of the characters, 5, 6 chapters in.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, okay, I'm still introducing the characters, I'm still getting people to know the characters. So this story is going to take a little while.
Mm-hmm.
So 95,000 words in, it felt right, So I never really know exactly how fast it's going to come together or how slow, because I'm trying to serve the story first before anything else, before a word count.
Mm.
And when you realized it's going to be a novel instead of a short story, did you change your way of working and writing?
No, the main thing I did was just to make sure I kept things on track from chapter to chapter. Like I knew, like, you've read the book, so like I'll be with one set of characters and the next chapter will be another set of characters. So I had to kind of keep track of what I wanted that next 2 or 3. I might like, I don't know if I just write down an idea for the next chapter and the next chapter and the next chapter. I might have 4 ideas that I want to address in the next 4 chapters. So that is how I kind of address the difference between writing a short story and a novel.
Mm-hmm. And you have touched upon Miriam quite a lot, but still, she's a very strong woman, but she's not the only strong woman in your story. I was wondering, I read on your homepage that a major influence in your life was your grandmother.
Oh, absolutely.
And is that where this love for strong women comes from?
I mean, it definitely, both my grandmothers are huge influences on my life. My father's mother and my mother's mother, Jeanette, taught me to paint, taught me and encouraged the creativity in me. And yes, I mean, this is where I began to realize that maybe the roles that have been presented, how you approach people, by gender or whatever, the female roles that I grew up with don't always mesh with what the society views it. I think every single human being can be strong. And I feel like people that are not always afforded the opportunity to present that tend to find ways to present their strength. And I think that is very true. That is where I learned to not just look for role models based on, how they match me, but also based on, what the character they present me with.
Mm-hmm.
And by a character, I mean like what they embody.
Mm-hmm.
I've had several strong female role models in my life, and I've had several strong males as well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that, but a lot of people should probably look for character over anything else,
Mm-hmm.
to have a role model.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they shouldn't consider anything other than that, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. 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 And were you ever tempted in this book to use first-person narration, use one of your characters as the narrator? Or or maybe just part of the story?
No, I never really considered the first person perspective. I think the closest I got to that is when I do a POV shift to Ambrose.
Mm-hmm.
when you're kind of inside his head, which I thought that would be a nice way to kind of round out the character, because he kind of seems not as fleshed out as others. It wasn't seeming like so, like, to his altered state. So I wanted to kind of show the inside of his mind. That's the closest I got to doing like a first person POV. But I wanted to show the scene from his perspective. But I felt with the number of characters, it might have diluted the story. It might have slowed it down a little bit, and also might have made it confusing.
And you said this book, you would put the label, well, publishers love labels, we all know that, adventure, historic adventure on your book. But the strong horror element leads me to the question, what draws you to this more horrific side?
To the dark side.
Yeah. Because they have the cookies, maybe.
I really, it's just what came out, and I thought it kind of helped to set the stakes, so to speak. I mean, I know that, like, I remember reading the first couple of reviews about how gory it was, and I'm like, really? I didn't think it was really even okay. But everyone's got their different, but it just seemed to set the stakes. And also, I hope it raised some questions for people, like, what is really happening here? Is this going to turn into, make it a little more unpredictable? Is this going to turn into a straight horror story? Because I was like particular seeing with lightning and stuff that to me reads like straight horror. But is it going to turn that way, or are we going to stay on, this kind of pace? So it also led to, I think, a level of unpredictability. But I mean, that's for readers to determine. But that's what I was hoping for.
Okay, absolutely, yeah. I mean, like I said, I enjoyed it. I mean, this combination of Western horror, adventure, the historic parts. I mean, a modern Western is also possible, but in your case, it's a historic Western. So it appeals to me. We agree on that, Teacup.
Yeah.
Yes, we know.
It's
we all know that. Put it in the past and I'm hooked. What can I say? And now, after writing the first novel-length book, what would be your advice for any other aspiring author out there?
I've got two things to advise people on. Write. Sit down and write. Do it. Don't think about it. Sit down and do it. Even if it's coming out and you think it's garbage, don't stop. Just plow through. That's what editing's for. Learn that editing is your friend. Maybe it's not that much fun to some people, but write. Don't stop. Don't do the writer's block thing. Just write. Even if it's coming out garbage, write. The other is read, because this is the one process that you get osmotically. What you read will come out filtered through you, but it will come out in your work. One of the things I had to do when I first started pursuing this is I read voraciously 18th, 19th century authors. And I didn't really mess with the 20th and 21st century. So language was very different back then. So if I'm trying to communicate with an audience today, I can't use the language like they used it back then. So I had to start reading more modern works to kind of change the way the word looked correctly to me on the page, because it has evolved so dramatically, over the last 300 years that it's almost unrecognizable.
And how much would you say is the influence through, like we mentioned before, for example, immigrants and now new technology?
Well, I think both of those things shift your culture. And so I think the influence there is great. The technology, I mean, it's easier to write now. It's easier to find a way to read. So in that regards, I think that's the driver that we have to push forward, but it's also a hindrance to us because there's so many different avenues. And even with the advent of AI, I'm a little bit frightened by that. I don't really want to get into that whole discussion, but it's a little bit daunting to see. So I don't want to, but I think trying to get back to the question you actually asked me, those influences basically change everything. When you have a flux of new people come in, they change ideas, they change the way a society functions. Technology does the same thing. So those have influenced us greatly. Like, you want to talk about 40 years ago, you had to go to the theater to see a movie. Talk about 100 years ago, if you wanted to go to a different world, you picked up a book. So the way we tell stories has evolved, the way that, and so that even, I think that's a huge influence on how we need to write now. It needs to be fast. It needs to be clear. And you don't need as many descriptors because more people are familiar with more things out there in the world when you're building a world. Like, whereas unless you're writing like Tolkien or Asimov, where you're creating whole new worlds, unless it's not familiar to people, you really need to, don't really need to spend copious amounts of time describing.
Describing the scene. If you write a story in the past, do you think you have to describe more than in the present?
I would think so. I mean, that's what I'm experiencing on the novel. I just finished the first and second draft on. It's set in modern times. And yeah, I didn't feel I was having to set the scene as much because, you're not walking into, a 2-room cabin, where they're cooking on a cast iron arm. You're walking into a modern house that most everybody is walking into. I mean, most people understand what a stove is or a microwave or a television. So I don't have to describe what that is. So I think, setting a scene is a little easier, a little more succinct, in a modern or contemporary work.
And how concerned were you with authenticity? Since writing historic things, you just mentioned people spoke differently and there's a lot of research involved. Was that one of your concerns? That people say, come on, what is he talking about?
Absolutely. Like, I don't know how many times I was like, did this word even exist back then? Or did this actually exist? What kind of cars were there? When did this bridge built? Like, the streets are accurate to the time. Like, literally anything that I put in there that's named, it existed at that time, whether that's the statue of the soldier in Millersburg, or it's the fact that there's 15 central hotels. Well, there was 5. Everyone named their hotel the Central Hotel for some reason. That's all a matter of history. So, I mean, I was in the Library of Congress. I was online, but I was digging deep. I was pulling out maps from the 1890s. I mean, this from counties, and just so I understood. Didn't, like I said, not all of that's in the book. This is in a dissertation on the history of the 1800s in the Midwest. But that information was important to me to have, so that if somebody did come across it, they could go, like mentioning the book. That was I found that out as I'm doing it. I knew what year I had it set in, and I'm like, holy heck, I got to work this in because it kind of makes sense with the rest of the story. So yeah, I mean, absolutely, very important to me.
And did you get an email or say a note from a reader who said, that's wrong, and yet you knew that's not wrong, you got it right?
So I wouldn't say they were saying it was wrong, but there's a scene in the book where someone's eating what's called scrapple. Princess is eating scrapple and it's a very northeastern thing. It's not a Midwest thing. It's a very it's like, you must be from New Jersey, because that's or the Northeast, because people in the Midwest don't eat that. And I was like, actually, I'm so happy you caught that. But that really was a nod to my father-in-law, who's from New Jersey, who he had to share Frapple with me. So I tried it once. I'm good. But I just kind of a tip of the cap to him.
Okay.
So people are fact checking all the time. Believe me.
Yeah, we heard that a lot.
And was there something you found out that you didn't put in, although you knew it was true, because you thought nobody would believe it?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of that in there. I mean, the fact that that it's loosely based on the idea of a true story. The fact that there was a blood cult that was basically disbanded in the Midwest. That was one. I think people probably are never going to believe that, but that was very true. The whole, I mean, the whole Amish thing is specifically the magic thing. I think people are probably going to think I'm off the rails on that one, even though the story itself is fantastical. But that's like a very real thing, and there's actually books about that. And I don't know why I'm drawing a blank on the one that they literally pass around in the community. It's things like that. Also like the automobiles. You know, we're talking 1890s, and most people think that that's a 20th century thing. But no, they've been around much longer than we remember. And how much electricity was used. How many towns had electricity at that point in time was a little bit even surprising to me. So those are some of the things I thought people would be like, no, but I haven't gotten a lot of pushback on that yet.
Like we said,
so maybe they know.
Yeah, like we said at the beginning, I mean, modernity was pushing west.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't believe it. I mean, I've bested you on the question about the plans, but can you elaborate what's coming next from you?
What's coming next for me is actually a middle grade adventure story. It's got a little bit of a supernatural bent to it because I think that's just where I am in my headspace, apparently. It's about a little boy and his dog, and they get pulled into a mystery in their hometown. And it all centers around the ghost story of the Phantom Funeral Coach. So the name of the book is Aristotle James and the Phantom Funeral Coach, and that comes out in September. And so that's my next one. I'm super excited to share this one with the world because this one's maybe a little more personal than Life is in the Blood. It's set in the 1980s, and I delineate that one very clearly from the start, so people know, because it's set up and it's in first person perspective. So so that's what's coming up next. It comes out in September. It's going to coincide with an appearance that I have at the WriterCon in Oklahoma City in September 1st. So that's what's coming out for me next. I have another modern thriller that's going to be coming out probably early 2024. And then the second book in the series of Aristotle James, and then Life is in the Blood 2. I don't have a name for it yet. We'll follow that. So I'm trying to do 2 a year. 2 a year is my goal. And I just want to keep it on the rails and keep the momentum going.
And something to look forward to. Absolutely. More from you. Good for the readers, I have to say. And Daniel, is there anything else you would like our listeners to know?
No, I mean, if you want to find me or the book, I'm on Instagram. It's at dbautz. The book is available on Amazon, and I believe it's in most marketplaces. If you want a signed copy, you can go to my website, which the links are through my Instagram link tree, so you can get that there. And I mean, any feedback anybody has, I want to hear it. Bad, good, indifferent. I mean, I want to know. This is my chosen craft, and anything I can do to make it better, I want to do that.
Okay. Splendid. Teacup? No more questions for our guests. So, Daniel, thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure talking to you.
It was an absolute blast for me. I'm so thankful. Thank you very, very much for having me on.
You did enjoy this episode as much as we did? Then hit subscribe and don't miss the next episode. Also, make sure to follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. If you like to support us and buy us a coffee, you can do so via Buy Me a Coffee and other platforms. You can find all the necessary links in the description. Until next time.